But yes, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And greetings, everyone. My name is Monalisa Hazarika, and I am the Strategic Communication and Partnership Officer here at the Scrap Weapons Project. And today, on behalf of the team, it is my privilege to moderate today's webinar on the New START Treaty and nuclear winter. With the New START Treaty set to expire next month, against a backdrop of increasingly casual rhetoric between nuclear powers, we face a threat that extends far beyond immediate blast zones to a global nuclear winter and mass starvation. In an era of reckless warfare and disregard for international law, this webinar aims to initiate a critical dialogue of warning regarding the catastrophic long-term consequences of nuclear conflict. This event is the first in a series of events that we will be hosting over the course of the next few months, and we are excited to hear your take on these pressing issues. Today, we are honored to have with us a distinguished panel of experts who bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to this critical discussion. Joining us are Professor Arthur Peterson and Professor Dan Plesch. Arthur Peterson is Professor of Science, Technology, and Public Policy at University College London and Chief Scientific Advisor to the Dutch Delta Commissioner. He is a member of Academia Europa, the European Academy of Humanities, Letters, and Science. He served as the chief scientist of the PBL Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency and continues to advise the Dutch government on environment and infrastructure. He has been an active member of the Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs since the 1990s, and Professor Peterson studied physics and philosophy and obtained a doctorate degree in atmospheric science, philosophy of science with science and technology studies, and theology with science and religion. Most of his research is about dealing with uncertainty. So welcome, Professor Peterson. Professor Dan Plesch is Professor of Diplomacy and Strategy at SOAS University, London, a door tenant at the legal chambers of 9 Bedford Row in London, and a fellow at the British Institute for International and Comparative Law. He is also the director of the Scrap Weapons Project. Professor Plesch read history at Nottingham, qualified in social work and public administration at Bristol, and holds a PhD in political science from Kiel. In 1986, he founded the British American Security Information Council, BASIC, and directed it from Washington, D.C. until 2001, when he became the Senior Research Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute for Defense and Security Studies in London. His most recent research includes Masters of the Air, Strategic Stability and Conventional Strikes, the Open Source Investigation in the Age of Google, and Women and the UN, A New History of Women's International Human Rights. So yeah, before I pass the floor to our speakers, I wanted to inform and encourage you to use the chat function to communicate your thoughts and ideas with your fellow participants, of course, keeping it respectful and professional, and the Q&A feature to submit your questions to our panelists, which we will be taking on after their presentations. Our project assistant, Ariana Richia, will be monitoring the Q&A function. So if you have any question at any stage of today's webinar, please submit them there. I would also like to request all our speakers to kindly keep their presentations under 10 minutes. And yeah, with that, I would like to first turn it over to Professor Peterson for the first presentation. Please, the floor is yours.
Many thanks to all of you online for joining us to explore questions around the end of New START and the never-ending risk of nuclear winter or nuclear fall. The term and the precise magnitude of the risk do matter, of course, but the emphasis here is not on making reliable predictions. Instead, I aim to discuss some of the environmental risks of nuclear weapons use while being transparent about the uncertainties attached to them. And this brings together several of my backgrounds, ranging from nuclear physics through the atmospheric sciences through to sustainability assessment. It has been in particular the Pugwash conferences on science and world affairs that have taught me the importance of scientists acting out their social responsibility. And this entails that scientists must illuminate the potentially far-reaching ecological effects of nuclear weapons use, including potential impacts of regional low-level nuclear exchanges on, for instance, global agriculture, food and hunger. This will not be a full-fledged introduction to the topic of the environmental risks of nuclear weapons. I'm just briefly going to highlight the importance of the topic, provide one example, emphasize the need to further study these risks, and that's all to underline the importance of nuclear disarmament and the importance of the deadline that's coming up with the end of New START. So let me start by drawing your attention to an excellent Oxford University Press book that came out last year and was written by two researchers who have been involved in studying nuclear winter scenarios from the 1980s, and that is Owen Bryan-Toone and Alan Robock. Dan Plash and I heard Alan deliver the Dorothy Hodgkin lecture at the Pugwash conference in Hiroshima last November. And we are actually very happy that he's joining us here now and also has indicated his willingness to pitch in. In their book, Earth in Flames, they describe the perils of nuclear winter through the lens of how dinosaurs were killed with asteroid fires that lofted soot, chilling the Earth for years, leading to collapse of the food chain and dooming the dinosaurs. Similarly, firestorms arising in urban nuclear targets can cause self-lofting plumes that block sunlight. So the authors emphasize the urgency to heed history to prevent it from repeating itself, then comparing humanity with the dinosaurs. I will show two scenarios that are included in the book based on recent studies on impacts on food. For a regional war between India and Pakistan, this map illustrates famine survivors by year 2 post-war. The impacts are predominantly in the north, the US, Europe, Russia, China, India. Much starvation as breadbasket yields crash under the haze. In the south, there are still refugia, Australia, New Zealand, parts of Indonesia, Southern Africa, South America, where populations there would experience milder cooling, but could still be impacted. For an escalated superpowers clash, matters are worse. Darker red covers more parts of the globe. And now all these scenarios need to be taken with quite a grain of salt, given the uncertainties in the assumptions made and in the scenarios and the modeling. Still, I would claim it's really important for decision makers, also those on topics other than directly related to nuclear weapons, to be aware of these risks. I would also like to highlight a recent comprehensive report from the National Academies in the US, which came out in June last year. And I want to note that the United Nations will publish an even broader report next year, coming from its independent scientific panel on the effects of nuclear war, which will also be worth paying attention to. The National Academies report reviewed the non-fallout environmental impacts of nuclear wars, from regional skirmishes to superpower clashes, via the entire causal chain. This causal chain is graphically shown in the report with all the linkages between subsystems, which can then be used to discuss the propagating uncertainty across the system, from the detonations to the fires, to the plumes, to the climate shifts, to the ecosystem changes, and to the societal impacts. I will not go into the details shown in this diagram, but this just highlights the many areas where knowledge is needed and where there are still uncertainties. The report recommends, among other things, US multi-agency model intercomparisons, war game scenarios, fire validations, resilience studies. It especially urges addressing behavioral and human factors for robust projections. Finally, in an October article of Arms Control Today, Andrew Ross analyzes the National Academy's somewhat ambivalent endorsement of nuclear winter theory, tracing epistemic divides from the 1980s somewhat apocalyptic hype to today's more bounded certainties. The national academies affirm the climate famine chain, but highlight gaps. Broadly speaking, moderate risks are validated while the earlier extremes are looked at as being less plausible. In his critical analysis, Ross spotlights polarization. Civilian scientists like Toon and Roebuck warn of glacial cooling and self-assured destruction, which implies first strike isn't a real possibility because of the environmental effects of nuclear weapon use. To the contrary, scientists affiliated with the US National Nuclear Security Administration advocate restraint, citing overstated models tied to first strike doctrines. This mirrors the long-standing feud between astrophysicist Carl Sagan of Cornell University and nuclear physicist Edward Teller of the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, exemplifying a still present split within the scientific community. This all reveals the value-ladenness of science, which is not a bad thing per se, but it can confuse audiences if the discussion isn't framed properly. This is what I wanted to say by way of introducing the topic of nuclear winter. Let me conclude with offering a couple of recommendations before we will hear from Dan about New START. One, fund multimodal validation on the effects of nuclear war. So commission intermodal comparisons, for instance, to refine these famine maps, bolster Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change style assessments for policy credibility. Enhance the resilience planning for nuclear winter, nuclear fall, and have critical engagement in the sense that scholars must critically unpack the value-laden assumptions of both the nuclear winter discourse, which may be over-dramatizing the risk, but also maybe not. And there is the discourse also of its detractors, which very likely is actually downplaying the risk. And then to conclude, and this may be a good segue over to Professor Plesch, is this leads to the need to prioritize arms control renewal. And it also leads to urging this extension of the New START beyond next month. So this concludes my presentation and handing it back to the chair.
Thank you, Professor Peterson, for your remarks on the potential environmental effects of nuclear war, especially the diagram that you shared on the climate, famine, the chain of events that might uncover. And your recommendation surely offers food for thought for anyone interested in conducting more research on this nexus. And with that, I would like to move on to the second speaker of today's event, which is Professor Dan Plesch. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mona Lisa. Thanks to Ariana helping look after us all, and to Arthur for getting us off to a great and very well balanced start. This webinar is inspired by Professor Roebuck's presentation at the Pugwash conference in Hiroshima. And I have to confess, I did not have this issue at the front of my mind in considering these issues until his reminder, and I look forward to his joining us with his comments. But also, as we think about this, I'd be very keen on members of the audience to put their own questions in as we go forward, and to join the discussion. And that this webinar is not a one-off, but the first of many. And if you want our support, Professor Roebuck as well, in your own events, in your own circles, then we will do all we can to support that. The last main plank of global weapons control, this US-Russian START treaty controlling their strategic weapons, nuclear weapons, expires in a few days' time. Like a rabbit out of a hat, Putin and Trump may sign it in gold pens, in a gold forum, no doubt, and have a stay of execution for a year. But at the moment, there is very little global attention to arms control and disarmament, despite almost a routine warnings in the media from politicians about potential wars, nuclear wars, here, there, and everywhere. Loose talk of nuclear signaling, as it sometimes is called now, and the potential limited use of nuclear weapons rarely, if ever, factor in a debate about the potential impact of nuclear winter. Let's consider a few examples. I was at a discussion recently in Geneva where a Russian analyst explained strongly that nuclear weapons were essential for attacking airfields in warfare because conventional high explosives, the damage could be repaired far too quickly within a few days. And he gave examples of where conventional high explosive attack had failed to put airfields out of action. So the idea of, just with this one example of nuclear weapons as war-fighting weapons is alive and kicking. We know from the historical record that NATO nuclear war games for decades under the title Wintex, and the archives are coming clear, routinely called for packages, as they call them, of 150 nuclear artillery shells, as seen in the slide in my image, to be fired. That slide, by the way, is a live firing exercise from a cannon at the Nevada test site in 1953. And the US went on to deploy thousands of these in Germany, and the Russians to an extent as well. But these were supposed to be used to repel Russian tank attacks in Germany in the Cold War. But none of these documents have any notice about what never mind the escalation, which is attended to, but the overall impact. And at that time, there was no awareness or understanding that the effects of nuclear weapons could extend beyond the immediate. And indeed, when it came to immediate effects, subsequent studies have shown, revealed that the US military only ever factored in the effect of blast, not of heat and radiation in weapons effects in many of their considerations. Now, when it comes to nuclear signaling, of course, we hear Russian commentators habitually speculating now about the use of nuclear weapons in relation to this or that in Ukraine and NATO. Not to be seen to be slouching, the US Navy has over the last decade taken to surfacing its Trident nuclear missile submarines in locations as varied as Gibraltar and Guam. Whereas even in the Cold War, nuclear missile submarines were regarded as sacrosanct and secret, never to be, as it were, brandished in public. Now, surfacing a Trident missile submarine is now a signal of nuclear virility. Looking at current developments of nuclear weapons production, modernization is the legitimating word. A key argument used to support the US building large numbers of new nuclear missiles in silos in the Midwest is the so-called sponge theory, that building missiles across the Midwest again would invite the Russians to use up their arsenal by attempting a first strike. This nonsense serves as a rationale for spending money and the so-called well-known military-industrial complex, but there's no mention of these considerations of how far Russia might be self-deterred by nuclear winter and the subsequent harvest failures in its own country. The concept which we are coming to see as a suicidal policy rather than a mad policy. The risks are rising, and we hear of Putin's succession of doomsday missiles. We read of cyber, IAI, hypersonics, but the study that I conducted with my colleague Manuel Galileo, who's with us, also detailed the very real very present risk in our study Masters of the Air, which discusses and unpicks the euphemism of Western military PR blended deterrence, using conventional and nuclear weapons to attempt to fight and win a two-way or a three-way war with Russia and China. That strategic conventional weapons to carry out preemptive strikes or as part of nuclear strikes, this mix of conventional and nuclear existed on the battlefield level with the sort of cannon in my slide, where these cannon could fire high explosive or nuclear weapons, depending on the requirement. But only today, and it is barely discussed, are particularly the Americans looking at the blending of conventional strategic strike and nuclear. Now, for a decade or more, the Russian and Chinese leaders have sought to include these types of weapons for strike and also for strategic defense, the Golden Dome. I thought for a moment the president was talking about his own hair when he was describing Golden Dome, but no, the idea of missile defense, that conventional strike and defense weapons should, the Russians and the Chinese argue, be included in future arms control. Western strategic studies broadly and the attending media and policy community pretty much act as if China and Russia never expressed this point of view. And traditionally, there has always been a concern that one should have a clear firewall between strategic nuclear weapons and conventional weapons. But this is now eroded. And in another talk, and you can look at our study, Masters of the Air, as weapons are fielded now, there is a now fielded blend of conventional and nuclear. And this poorly understood feature is an added level of uncertainty in crisis management and escalation, and provides a further rationale as to why we need the START Treaty extended and far more ambitious weapons controls. For example, I suggested to the European Leadership Network a zero option for all missiles, ballistic cruise, drones, and we are developing, and we'd love you to join us, ideas for a new global structure, a COP for weapons, echoing the COP in climate change, a global system for weapons controls, an initiative perhaps for the emerging coalition of the willing of small and middle powers intent on re-energizing the global system in the face of the suicidal vandalism being foisted upon us by President Trump. Going forward, I think we need to remind states and regional organizations across the global south that nuclear war is not, and indeed never was, a northern affair. We need to be aware that regional wars in West Asia, South Asia, Europe have the potential to devastate the populations of the entire planet. We need to engage with media and politicians who are involved in military and political exercises around the annual cycle of nuclear war planning. The old NATO Wintex has been supplanted, but the Russians, NATO, and the US and others have a cycle of nuclear exercises in which political leaders are involved. Shall we use this weapon, Minister, or that weapon? As far as I'm aware, none of these discussions, even today, focus on the global impact of escalation, and that beyond blast, heat, and radiation, there is a threat of dooming populations to starve in a real-life post-apocalyptic nightmare. The India-Pakistan nexus, as we've seen, is one example. Many of us are around universities, and deterrence in theory and practice is studied in elite universities around the world. But in my experience, the risks and psychological pressures of deterrence failing into nuclear winter is almost never considered. So I hope you will join us in these discussions. I want to stick to the time. But if nothing else, I hope we can, in this series of webinars and public discussions, that we can throw buckets of ice over the blind war fever that seems to be spreading ever more as we turn on our social media and other news outlets, and realize that arms control and disarmament are realistic necessities, not liberal accessories. Thank you so much, Mona Lisa.
Thank you, Professor Flesch, for your insights on strategic defense, conventional strike capabilities, and also new avenues for looking at this issue. All of the things that you mentioned, the related links are in the chat box. So if anyone's interested, please have a look. Now, before we open the floor for Q&A and interventions, I would like to invite a distinguished professor of climate science, Professor Alan Robock, for your intervention. Please feel free to unmute and take the floor.
Thank you very much for this invitation and for highlighting the work that we've been doing. Yes, the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons has been signed by half of the countries of the world and being followed by 2/3 of the countries. And they already know that they could suffer from a nuclear war even if no bombs are dropped there. Could you confirm that you can hear me and see me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, great. And so there are indeed uncertainties. I don't like the term nuclear fall because that's what Steve Schneider called it in his ego battle with Carl Sagan. But even if it's fall temperatures, that's not just football games and turning leaves. That means the crops die and you can't grow any food. So the extent of the environmental response to a nuclear war depends on how much smoke. And that's the biggest uncertainty. If a city burns, how much smoke would be put up? We've been trying to get funding from our government, and we haven't been able to get any government funding. And the only way we've been able to do research is from some philanthropic funding. It's not just the United States government, though every government in the world should be funding this research. There should be lots of teams looking at burning cities and how much smoke you get, lots of climate models doing the simulation, lots of crop models looking at the response to the various levels of climate change, changing temperature and precipitation and sunlight. So the National Academy report does say that if we get a lot of smoke, it would be a terrible catastrophe for the world. The question is how much smoke. And so we do need a lot more research, and I'm glad that you're bringing this up. And in most potential catastrophes, the analysis is a worst case analysis. In the case of the U.S. military establishment, they rather choose to look at a best case analysis and try to ignore this. In the testimony in front of the National Academy, they said, if we accept environmental impacts of nuclear war, that means deterrence doesn't make any sense. And that's exactly the point. So it's an existential threat to their establishment. But the National Academy report recommended pages and pages of different studies to be done, funded by the Department of Energy, which builds the bombs. And they, nevertheless, there's no program managers that are offering opportunities for people to do the research. And so we really need the people of the world to demand that we learn much more about this. And in the meantime, as was already said, there's plenty of evidence to demand that we get rid of our nuclear weapons now, because we're worried about global warming, which is real and caused by humans, but that would be gradual climate change. It is gradual climate change that's happening already. A nuclear war would produce instant climate change, instant cooling. It could happen tomorrow. There are 9 countries with nuclear weapons, and it's not hard to think of quite a few of them have unstable leaders that have the ability to start a nuclear war. Once a sort of a limited nuclear war might start, people talk about that. It's very hard to stop it from growing to something large. Almost all the war games I know about, once one bomb is used, it just escalates till the entire arsenals, and the rest of the world gets involved. So thank you for bringing up this issue. We really need more work, more support. We're continuing to work on it with philanthropic funding, and if any more teams want to work with us or get funding or provide funding, that would be great. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Robach. Indeed, we definitely need more funding for research on these kinds of topics and to look at the nexus between these two topics. With that, I would now like to open the floor for questions from our audience. Please feel free to use the Q&A feature to submit your questions, or the chat if that works better, and we will address as many as time permits. I will give it a minute or so to write down your questions. Okay, we have one hand raised. Paul Vasha, please go ahead.
Hello.
Yes.
So recently we heard that doomsday clock is now 85 seconds to the midnight. So what do you think? How effective are such tools for influencing public awareness and policy on global existential threats? Because this made a lot of news on social media. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul Vasha. The question is open for our speakers. Please go ahead.
I think it's great that they're doing this every year, and they consider not just nuclear threats, but threats from climate change, threats from AI, artificial intelligence, threats from biological weapons, and they of course interact. And so that's one way that people become aware of it once a year, and it's 85 seconds to midnight, the closest it's ever been. But they emphasize that we know how to move the clock back also. We need to and as was already mentioned by Professor Plush, we really need to get the New START treaty extended right now. Yeah, you're right. It would be wonderful with gold pens signing a 1-year extension, but that's not a treaty. That would not include intrusive inspections like we've had before to make sure each country is following the rules. There's no evidence that they're not right now, but it would be great if they did that. And the people have to, Barack Obama got the Nobel Peace Prize as soon as he became president, but nobody's quite sure why. And he said, "I'll do the right thing, but you have to push me to do it." So the people of the world in the 1960s pushed to get rid of nuclear weapons. They were afraid of it. And now nuclear war is not very high on people's agendas. They have other things that they worry about. And so and I hope we don't have to actually use a nuclear weapon again to stimulate people, but warnings like from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists are very important.
Might I jump in to add to that? Given I think quite a lot of there's a good discussion going on in the chat, and people in the chat might want to chip in verbally as well. Excuse me. However, I entirely endorse the idea of more research on the effects, but also, as we have probably quite a large academic audience, to engage with our professoriate and authors, the people who write about nuclear deterrence and international security, and pay no attention whatsoever to the nuclear winter issue. Now, this is a level of self-denial, which is, from a natural sciences perspective, inexcusable, but unfortunately all too familiar in the self-disciplining, politicized social sciences and indeed international history. So, students and faculty, challenge the editors and the professors. That's one practical thing, and we would be delighted to support. But also, as we connect to policy circles, looking at the policy cycle, as I said, we're sitting here on the cusp of February. The spring and summer tends to be the cycle that the nuclear weapons states carry out nuclear weapons exercises. Certainly, NATO and the US do. I think it's a summer activity. for these folks. And it's fairly easy to see from media coverage and so on when the Russians and the Indians, the Pakistanis do the same. And one of the things that we will be doing with your help is seeking to engage media and policymakers around this annual cycle of pretend nuclear war to say, hang on a minute, hang on a minute, do you really know what you're contemplating? And we know from the archives from NATO that, and current practice as well, that prime ministers of much of NATO and defense ministers are involved in these exercises. They're not just left to the generals. The politicians are involved, and therefore they need to be engaged and educated, because as it stands, they are just brought up and groomed, to use a modern word, groomed into the culture of nuclear war planning. And this is something that we can effectively challenge. And much as I absolutely support the warnings of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists and Pugwash and so forth, we need to be much better at forensically engaging with the institutions around us to move the debate rather than talking with ourselves. So, but the two concrete proposals we have are to engage, let us say, strategic deterrence academia, and to engage the spectrum of decision makers and media around the annual cycle of pretend nuclear war.
Thanks, Professor Flesch. Professor Peterson, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I'd really just want to second what both Alan and Dan are saying. And in terms of the questions in the chat, there was a discussion going on is nuclear winter disproven or not? And I think that even in the present situation, where if you have the number of weapons that you can count, including the numbers that you have in the different bombers, you can even get to the total number of detonations and the total amount of fires as Professor Roebuck says, in the worst case scenario. It's a real worst case scenario. And it has not been disproven. And I think that's a really important thing. And it's all, of course, in the assumptions that you make that go into the scientific assessment. But we have a responsibility not to just look at the best case. So that's on that one, and then some technical questions, and maybe there's a possibility for Professor Roebuck to come in on the question on the connection with volcanic smoke causing years without summer. There's something in the chat there. Maybe you're able to respond to that one, because you have studied that.
Kilauea shirt on. Yes, volcanic eruptions are an analog also. And after the Tambora eruption of 1815, there was famine globally because of the effects of the particles that the volcano put up into the atmosphere. But the smoke from fires would be much, much more and cause much more cooling. All the climate models will tell you if you put a certain amount of smoke in, you'll get this climate response. That's not really under debate. Even a study done at the Lawrence Livermore National Lab, where they build the weapons, shows that. The question is how much smoke. And there are right now, the U.S. and Russia each have about 2,000 strategic weapons, in addition to the tactical ones, which are much bigger than previous ones that were strategic. And there aren't enough targets in Russia and the United States for all these weapons. You'll be bouncing the rubble if you use them all. And so there's plenty of weapons. And if you attack a city or an industrial area, there's a lot of stuff to burn. If you attack an airfield or a missile silo, there's not much stuff to burn, and so you get dust, which falls out pretty quickly. But there's lots of military targets in cities. As Dan said, the military doesn't consider the effects of fires. They say, we know about blast, we know about radioactivity, we don't know much about fire, so we're just going to ignore it for now. And so I say to them, well, okay, tell me what your targeting strategy is, and we'll calculate for you how much smoke you're going to get and how much famine you're going to get. Oh no, that's secret. So what we're developing is some software to give to the military of each country where they can enter their targets, the size of the weapons, whether it's an air burst or a ground burst, and it will calculate for them how many people are going to die, and it'll be disconnected from the internet so they can do it in secret, and then they won't be able to say that we don't know, and they'll be able to follow the law of war, which doesn't allow them to kill innocent civilians far from the targets. And so we're working on that too. But we really have to publicize this and get funding for not our team, but for additional people to do it. Why aren't the Russians funding this research? Why aren't the British? There's one team at the University of Exeter that's working on our project, but that's it, and it's funded by a Future of Life Institute in the United States. Why isn't the British government, the ARIA project, just put out $75 million, more than 50 million pounds to study geoengineering? But why don't they care about what would be the impacts if they use their nuclear weapons? So it's not just many people could do this, and it's cheap research. It's just modeling and sitting in front of a computer. It's not building lots of things. And so yeah, Gladstone and Dolan is not secret. We already know about that. So let's do a better job of that.
Thank you. We have quite a few questions. Let me read them out. One's from Paul Meyer. Has the UK made a statement calling for extension of the New START and pursuit of a successor treaty? And there's another one. What is the future of arms control and disarmament after the New START treaty? So over to you.
Well, as the resident Brit, I may have missed it, but there may have been something said very quietly by the Starmer government, but I haven't seen anything. On the one hand, the future of arms control is dismal and non-existent after START, but the old geezers making the presentation here will know that in the past we have gone from a situation of fearing nuclear war and no arms control at all to within a handful of years seeing major agreements and major political change in a very positive way. So I think there is all to play for, and as I reprise with my own students, international affairs is not a spectator sport.
Professor Peterson or Professor Robock, if you have any comments on those questions.
Well, it's a problem that's been produced by humans, and so humans can solve it. And it's much simpler than solving the global warming problem. You have to get rid of a few weapons. But it's all about greed. That's why we have the problem of global warming. That's why we have this problem. A lot of people are making a lot of money developing the technology. And in the United States, almost every congressional district has a military factory of some sort. And so they put a lot of money into continuing their business. When the New START treaty was signed by Obama and Medvedev, in order to have it ratified by the U.S. Senate, many Republican senators needed to approve it. It was a 2/3 vote, and Obama made a deal. I'll modernize our nuclear arsenal if you sign the treaty, which is what happened. And now we're spending over $1 trillion to build new weapons, new missiles to be buried out west to be never used, and new bombers and new submarines and new missiles, and so new bombs. And so people are making a lot of money from it, and it's really hard to few professors like us to fight against this huge army of lobbyists that go in and say, deterrence, be afraid, we need more weapons. It's hard to really get the mouthpiece. This webinar is great, but how can we amplify the message?
Yeah, I just want to re-emphasize the social responsibility of not only institutions, but also individual engineers, individual scientists. They have to kind of fight for, and it depends on the country, freedom to choose their research topics, and they also at some kind of level they have influence on what national science foundations are willing to fund as well, and including advising governments, like for instance in the UK, this kind of ARIA funding. There are avenues, there are ways to execute the responsibility to kind of broaden the the agenda, while being aware of powers that be and money that's at stake. So it's just a plea in a sense, and that's then related to how we train the next generations of scientists, how we discuss these things in the classroom, how we train our PhD students when they become enculturated in a particular culture. So that's part, and I've learned a lot about this from the PACWASH Conferences on Science and World Affairs. Be very active as a leader in the International Student Young PACWASH movement as well. So just want to put a plug in for the importance of those activities to indicate that those who think about this, that they're not alone.
I wonder if Martin Butcher just posted the something about Britain and New Start. Do you want to say a word, Martin?
Maybe you could just read his statement.
Is it in the chat there? Okay.
Can you
unmute Martin? Someone? Is that possible? Is that possible, Ariana?
I'm working on it. Could you maybe by then look at a question from Fidel on how should we understand the correlation between governance design and power in nuclear diplomacy, where a hypothetical nuclear COP would strengthen multilateral norms but constrain great power discretion? A Trump-style peace board would do the reverse by privileging discretion over legitimacy, while the UN remains indispensable yet increasingly bypassed. Does this reflect a structural tension that cannot be resolved within a single institutional framework?
Blimey. That question is an entire academic article. I'm impressed. I'm not quite sure how to respond because it is so complex as a question. The punchline is the question of can one institutional framework do all this? Well, no, probably not. But one needs to push different options. Typically, the superpowers tend to go into a small dark room and work it out without involving other people, but only after they have been under immense pressure from smaller states and international society. Does that help?
The United Nations has started a new study of not just the environmental impacts, but many other impacts of nuclear war, and the team is working on that now. So but I understand they're not very well funded, but they are working together, and we'll have a report next year. So at least the UN is concerned about this. The meetings of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, however, which is an agreement that we still have, requires that the nuclear nations work toward disarmament, and that part is completely ignored. So even if we have these international meetings, it still needs the will of the nuclear nations to do something about it. Martin, do you want to say something now?
Sure, thank you. So yeah, what I posted is from Hansard. It's the latest statement I could quickly find by the British government. It's not a strong defence of nuclear arms control, disarmament, or non-proliferation for that matter. But it does sadly fit with the priority, the importance that this government and the previous government has given to this topic over years now. And you know, we might have hoped for something stronger from a Labour government than a Conservative government, but we haven't got it. And in fact, you know, the last really meaningful arms control of any kind was done by the Conservatives, or that Britain was part of, was done by the Conservatives, the Arms Trade Treaty. And in the years since then, British governments have been consistently regarding treaties that restrict their freedom of action in this field as obstacles to be got around rather than principles to be lived up to. So, for what it's worth. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. I don't see any questions. If I may pose a question from my end, how do we communicate the reality of nuclear winter without triggering fatalism or disengagement, especially to help non-expert circles to understand these risks better?
I have that problem. It's a really depressing topic. The psychologists tell you it's better just to pretend you didn't hear it. As Mark Twain said, denial ain't just a river in Egypt. It feels better just to pretend you didn't hear it and go on your way and hope somebody else solves the problem. The answer is to give people something to do about it. What can you tell people to do about it? Young people can join Young Pugwash. Scientists can join the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction, which has about 2,000 members now. We run it out of Princeton University, and we have webinars and ways to take action. But is there some other way we can do it? And in the United States, there are at least 10 different anti-nuclear organizations, and they all sort of struggle for funding, and they know each other, and they all sort of agree, but they don't work together. Can we get some sort of group together to do it? Pugwash, I was honored to go to the Pugwash meeting in Japan, but Pugwash had a statement after it. I went to a meeting of Nobel Prize winners in Chicago this summer, where on the anniversary of the first test, and that's where the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists is, and they had a very strong statement about this. But who pays attention to those statements? We need something more to get people's attention, and if somebody has the answer to that, I'd like to hear it.
Well, Alan, at the risk of being repetitious, I would say that engaging with the professoriate and the publishers and the editors who teach nuclear deterrence to generations without considering this topic, which has been around for almost half a century, but doesn't feature in deterrence studies. It needs to. And I think that is something that can be raised by people in the classroom, can be raised with the faculty, can be raised with editorial boards to change the discourse. That's something which is, I think, within the immediate purview of many of the people and their friends in this discussion. And the other is to focus attention of NGOs and others, amongst other things, not just on the fruitless UN conference cycle, but on the real world engine of annual nuclear weapons exercises, which always get a bit of attention, but we're intent on helping people focus on that. So these are our two takeaways that will hopefully provide a bit of hope and energy into this febrile, fantastical discussion or such loose talk about limited nuclear war that we hear so much in so many different parts of the world. These are our two very precise takeaways that we will be having further webinars on, and hope that through our various networks we can develop this over the next 6 or 9 months.
And from my side, so I work also as a chief scientific advisor to the Dutch Delta Commissioner, where it's in my remit with a team to highlight what are the what-if surprises that may be coming. And these are surprises that are not just coming from outside, they are triggered by particular levels of global warming. We don't know which. For instance, the stopping or the slowing of the Atlantic Meridional overturning circulation, which would give a local cooling and drying in Europe, let's say. To find ways to communicate that in terms of the resilience and the risks that are coming, there are ways we need to kind of get prepared. I don't want to do exactly the same for the nuclear winter scenario, because that's something we can avoid. In another way, It's a different, I agree with you, Alan. It's in a sense a much simpler problem than the climate change problem. I mean, not necessarily in terms of how the powers exactly work, but it's so much, very few decisions have to be made and it can be solved. And it would be really good if more people realize that it is not as difficult to solve. So you don't have to be as depressed as you may actually become from the climate change issue as a whole.
Are there any local movements in the Netherlands to get rid of the nuclear weapons that you hold for NATO, for example?
Not so much. I mean, we have to get more active also in the Dutch Backwatch group. And there are several organizations, of course, also in the Netherlands working on nuclear disarmament, but I have not noticed it recently in any kind of public sphere. So no.
We wrote that book to get people's attention and I'm glad that you started the talk with it. I was really honored. We haven't been able to get a review of the book published, so we'd like to get more. It was to bring in people. Brian Toon did a TED talk about dinosaurs and then mentioned nuclear winter at the end. He got 9 million views so far. That's why we wanted the dinosaurs to bring people in. And so I'm glad it's getting some attention slowly, but it's still a struggle to have people pay attention to this when they're worried about their health care or the price of food or other things that are or crazy leaders like Trump. And they, the last nuclear war was 80 years ago, and so it couldn't happen again. People have solved the problem, right? This deterrence works. Let's not worry about it. People have to be educated.
Thank you all. I do not see any questions in the Q&A or chat. So with that, we are coming an end to today's session. And as we conclude today's webinar, I want to extend our sincere gratitude to our panelists for sharing their expertise and to all the participants for your very active engagement. As we look ahead, it is clear that the risks posed by nuclear winter demand sustained attention, cross-sectoral dialogue, and the courage to rethink long-standing assumptions about security and also responsibility. We will be continuing these discussions with another event next month, so please stay tuned and keep an eye on our website and social media channels for updates and ways to stay engaged. Thank you and have a wonderful rest of your day.